Page 1 Introduction. Kumkum Roy. Para. The inclusion of a volume on women in early Indian societies within the present series is in a sense symptomatic of the position of women's studies and questions of gender within the discipline. On the one hand, it marks a welcome recognition of the importance of this particular field of study. On the other, it also recognizes the possibility of situating women's history within the broad perspectives of social history, which in turn permits of the raising of a range of questions. Para. Yet this is by no means unproblematic. Access to and incorporation within certain disciplinary spaces implicitly precludes the possibility of exploring and extending analysis of gender relations in other contexts, such as histories of the state, agrarian systems, or exchange networks, for instance. While there have been attempts to contextualize analysis of gender relations in terms of specific political and economic formations, bracket opens, and some examples are included in the present collection, bracket closes, these have still not made their way into mainstream history. Para. One can, as has been done often enough, attribute the invisibility of such perspectives to long-standing biases within the discipline, both theoretical and methodological, as well as those of individual, predominantly male practitioners. As has been pointed out recently, bracket Crosby, CROSBY, 1991, colon 1, bracket closes, comma, fascination with both history, H capital, and the, quote, woman question, unquote, was typical of the middle classes in 19th century Britain. These were in a sense interrelated as, quote, man, unquote, was constituted as the subject of historical processes, whereas questions about women were framed in terms of their nature, which was, by definition, unchanging and hence, to some extent, ahistorical. This disciplinary legacy is still with us. Para. But this seems to me to provide only a part of the explanation. It is important to remember that by the end of the 19th century, the suffragette, suffragette, suffragette movement provided both a visible and vocal, page 2, contestation of the divide between history, H capital, and the, quote, woman question, unquote, as women were claiming access to political rights which were located within a specific, as such, by the beginning of the 20th century, spaces for investigating women's histories were opened up. Para. More specifically, in the Indian context, while the interest in both history and the, quote, woman question, unquote, derived from the colonial encounter, they were also refracted in this situation. Thus, there was no simple replication of the concerns or perspectives which emerged in 19th century Britain. What we find instead is that both the existence and the nature of the Indian past were viewed as contested domains. Para. Even at the risk of oversimplification, it is perhaps worth drawing attention to the broad contours of these domains. On the one hand, the colonizers attempted to define the entire colonized population, including and especially its males, as feminine. Amongst other things, this involved denying and/or denigrating the past of the subject population in order to naturalize and rationalize the colonial enterprise. In this situation, one of the responses of the Western educated indigenous elite consisted of attempts to reclaim and reconstitute their past. Para. Within this context, the discussion on the quote, woman question unquote, while not entirely disassociated from the problem of woman's quote, nature unquote, was at the same time historicized. To an extent, this was related to the understanding that, quote, position of women, unquote, was an index of civilization. We will return to the ways in which this was worked out later. What is less apparent but nonetheless likely is that this somewhat precocious focus on women's history had to do with the challenge posed to indigenous masculine identities. One defensive strategy in the face of charges of effeminacy may have been to focus on the separate histories of men and women. Para. Thus, we have the phenomenon of the persistent visibility accorded to women within certain kinds of histories of early India. As has been stated in a different context, quote, women made an irreversible entry into political discourse as symbolic pawns in a complex ideological background, unquote, bracket, Kandioti, Kandiyyoti, 1988:220, bracket closes, stop. In a sense, this is best illustrated by Alteker's The Position of Women in Hindu Civilization, bracket 1938, bracket closes, which represents the culmination and consolidation of a definition of the quote, woman question unquote, which was designed to meet the requirements of a specific historical agenda. Alteker, who was a prolific scholar, page 3, produced a treatise on, in italics, Education in Ancient India, italics closes, 1934, and another on italics, State and Government in Ancient India, italics closes, 1949, 1958. Apart from more specialized works, the author envisaged these, along with The Position of Women, as works which would appeal to both the general reader as well as to the scholar. Alteker 1958 : small Roman 5. This preoccupation with the more immediate past and the present explains why such histories often end by laying down an explicit agenda for the future. Para. In fact, two of the three works with which we introduce the present collection, Alteker's The Position of Women in Hindu Civilization and Horner's Horner's Women Under Primitive Buddhism, date to the 1930s. Neither was an isolated intellectual venture. We can trace their predecessors through the preceding decades. What distinguishes Alteker's and Horner's works from earlier studies is their internal coherence and the wealth of detail. As such, they have remained influential even after 6 or 7 decades. Para. In contrast, much of the subsequent scholarship on the theme has tended to focus on what are relatively narrow areas of investigation chronologically, spatially, and in terms of categories of analysis. As such, we have insights into some historical context but not into others. Besides, the connection among the areas of investigation require to be worked out. Consequently, the impact on the discipline has tended to be fragmented, and the possibility of an intellectual upheaval remains as yet unrealized. Para. Most attempts at historical analysis confront and attempt to circumvent certain fundamental problems. One of these pertains to situating women vis-a-vis what are identified as major historical processes. We can observe two broad possibilities which are often combined either explicitly or implicitly. The first envisages historical developments as by definition autonomous and focuses on the impact they had on women. In other words, women are viewed as passive receptacles with their quote status unquote or quote position unquote changing to reflect the state of the world around them. As a corollary, variations in the status of women are then treated as indices of relative barbarity or civilization. The second possibility, which has been articulated both less frequently and less systematically, envisages a certain degree of agency for women vis-a-vis historical processes. Para. Women's history in particular and history in general are implicated in contemporary political discourse. As such, evaluations of either of these explanatory strategies or attempts to combine them do not remain questions of pure epistemology, but feed into a range of, page 4, problems relating to positions within the women's movement, strategies for women's studies, including the complex interaction between activists and academics, as well as positions outside the movement. It is with these possibilities in mind that we need to explore the implications of adopting alternative explanatory strategies. Para. Alteker's work and those modeled on his framework are most representative of the first perspective. He identifies two contradictory long-term trends influencing the position of women, one, a decline in their familial status, religious rights, and in their participation in public life, and two, an increase in their proprietary rights. Of these, the first is thought to outweigh the second. Thus, within an overarching commitment to the definitional primacy of history, H capital, as determining the position of women, in effect, certain spheres or institutions are isolated as being particularly relevant to women. Of these, the family is clearly privileged, as the discussion on women within various familial relations occupies more than half the text. Besides, even the discussion on religious practices and women's access to property are located within the context of the family. Almost inevitably, this implies a homogenized understanding of a single, unitary type of family, which is idealized as a counterpoint to what are implicitly or explicitly understood to be the institutions of the degenerate waste, W-E-S-T-W capital. It also means that there is a tendency to create hierarchies amongst indigenous familial forms and to marginalize those which appear to deviate from strictly patrilineal models. Bracket, Chakravarti, 1996, bracket closes, stop. Text continued in next file. Page 4. Introduction continued. Para. As is evident from the aforesaid, Altecker locates his history of women along two axes of comparison, one within Indian history and second with other known societies or civilizations. Within this framework, what he identifies as the oldest known society in the Indian context that ascribed to the early Vedic age is also conceived as the best from the point of view of women. This is substantiated in terms of access to education, a relatively high age of marriage, monogamy, the absence of seclusion and sati, and possibilities of widow remarriage. These indices of status are viewed as interrelated. Thus, it is suggested that as ritual education became more complex, women had to remain unmarried for longer spells in order to acquire it. This was by definition impossible. As such, there was both a decline in access to education and a lowering of the age of marriage. Page 5, para. In the case of almost all these criteria, one can argue that the evidence is more complex than Altecker suggests. For instance, while references to women seers in the Rig Veda are regarded as an indication of access to education, this does not take into account the number, bracket, a handful out of 1,000, bracket closes, and the nature of the compositions attributed to them. Moreover, while Altecker treats education as monolithic and positive and understands it as leading to access to the prestigious domain of ritual and religion, it is obvious that in any historical situation there would have been more than one definition of education, as indeed there would have been of religion or ritual. If one envisages a situation of multiple and possibly contending systems of education and / or socialization, historical explanation may become somewhat less facile. In other cases, such as the age of marriage, tangible data to argue for trends of lowering or raising the age are extremely difficult to come by. Para. Another problem with identifying a set of criteria is that this is then mechanically applied to different historical situations. For instance, access to property may be regarded as an index of women's status. If this rests on a definition of property which is treated as absolute and invariable without being qualified or contextualized, bracket, see section 2 which follows, bracket closes, it can lead to ahistorical analysis. Besides, the possibility that there may have been a relative shift in the nature and significance of specific criteria is often not recognized. Consequently, the historical analysis offered have a curiously static and repetitive quality. Para. Even more problematic is the broader causal nexus within which these criteria are embedded. While Altecker makes a casual reference to women's involvement in production in the Vedic age as being partly responsible for their high status, this is not carried through. Instead, their high status is also and more consistently connected with militarism and expansionism, the consequent shortage of women, and the need for producing warrior sons. Low status, on the other hand, is viewed as stemming from a relatively peaceful situation where a luxurious lifestyle is at a premium and where women are sex objects rather than instruments of procreation. The possibility that such roles are not mutually exclusive and that there may have been other roles which were combined with these remains unexplored. Para. More insidious is the equation between high status and what is understood as the predominance of the Aryan woman, low status hinging on the influence of the Shudra woman on the former. Page 6. Besides, foreign invasions are invoked time and again as an explanation for certain restrictions on women. As such, the low status of women is viewed as extrinsic to the indigenous social order. Thus, the explanatory framework is colored by caste, casteist, casteist, and occasionally communal overtones. Apart from these obvious political implications, such explanations are simplistic, as the interaction between indigenous and extraneous peoples was complex. In fact, both populations would have been stratified rather than homogeneous. Hence, the relations between the two categories was not necessarily always sharply polarized. Para. Another dichotomy which is often invoked for explanatory purposes is that of the renouncer versus the householder. A variety of, quote, social ills, unquote, are attributed to the growing importance of asceticism. This ignores the fact that the renunciatory orders opened up new spaces for women. Para. It is to these spaces that Hena draws attention. Hers was not the first attempt to locate women within Buddhism. In 1927, B.C. Law published a monograph on women in Buddhist literature, which he believed to be, quote, the first of its kind, unquote. Bracket Law 1981 Roman I small. Bracket closes stop. While his work was less detailed and less focused than Hena's, he felt that women had, quote, advanced, unquote, within Buddhism, and that, quote, the advance was the work of the women themselves, ... Stop. It was women who made men and their chachas recognize them, unquote, bracket ibid, bracket closes, stop. Incidentally, both Hena and Law were situated within a different disciplinary tradition, that of Buddhist and Pali studies as opposed to history. Para. Hena's categories of analysis are twofold. For instance, lay women and alms, ALMS, alms women. She focuses in particular on the latter. While familial relations are recognized as important for the first, as well as to an extent for the second category, Hena also explores the category of the woman worker, not necessarily located within domestic spaces. The definition of work and workers is somewhat eclectic, including agriculture, spinning, the maintenance of cremation grounds, and categories such as acrobats, musicians, dancers, slaves, and courtesans. Clearly, the criterion underlying the selection is the ability of such women to support themselves and occasionally others, rather than questions of the extent to which they were part of productive processes. Possibilities of a sexual division of labor and its implications are not raised, although they are implicit in the evidence which is presented. While this may appear to be somewhat limited, it is nonetheless valuable in recognizing the existence of women outside domesticity. Page 7. To some extent, it seems that the opening up of these areas of investigation was possible because Horner was not constrained by the requirements of conforming to the disciplinary norms of history, H capital, whether of the colonial or the nationalist varieties. Para. Horner raises and explores a different set of questions with respect to the order of nuns or bhikkhunis. Here she argues for a two-way relationship between women and Buddhism. On the one hand, she accepts that Buddhism opened up a certain space for women. At the same time, she suggests that women not only shaped the contents of that space, but that in doing so, they redefined Buddhism to a certain extent. In other words, she attributes a degree of agency to women within this particular framework. Horner attempts to substantiate her hypothesis by exploring the avowed reasons behind women joining the order. She also works through the evidence for the creation and consolidation of a predominantly woman-centered community and produces an account which is rich in detail. At another level, she explores the specific forms of self-expression and the articulation of the experience of enlightenment attributed to the bhikkhunis. What is interesting is that in the process, Horner reevaluates certain stereotypical motions which recur with monotonous regularity in accounts of women in early India. This is most obvious in the treatment of the theme of dress and ornaments. Conventionally, this provides the framework for locating women within the realm of aesthetics or fashion, and of extending this to trivialize women by implying that these are amongst their major concerns. Horner deals with the theme, but within the context of the dress code prescribed for the bhikkhunis. As such, it is explored as an index of notions of female sexuality and as a mode of containing it rather than as a superficial preoccupation with the decorative. Horner's notion of women's agency, which underlies her analysis, can be called into question from the standpoint of more nuanced understandings. For instance, Sangari, 1993, Sangari, Sangari, which would suggest that it is somewhat simplistic to conceive of women's agency in direct, unmediated terms. Nevertheless, her work is valuable in opening up the possibility of recognizing the existence of certain spaces within which the active participation of women in the historical process was likely. I am inclined to connect Horner's ability to conceptualize, identify, and to an extent substantiate her notion of women's space, page 8, no matter how circumscribed, to the environment within which she worked and lived. She was associated for a number of years with Newnham College, Newnham, Newnham College, one of the few centers for women's education in Cambridge, and shared an enduring and close relationship with women friends, including her companion of 30 years, Elsie Butler. It is also likely that her ability to envision women's space was possible because of a relatively limited frame of reference. Her interests centered on the formative phase of Buddhism, whereas Alteker attempts a more ambitious synthesis. However, there are other indications of a more fundamental difference in perspective. To an extent, this is reflected in their handling of the related problems of periodization and sources. It is a truism that an implicit or explicit understanding of significant historical changes underlies the adoption of one or the other scheme of periodization. Conventionally, a number of possibilities have been available to historians of early India. These include the relatively simple dynastic periodization, where major ruling dynasties are recognized as historically distinct from one another. Given that women have rarely had direct access to positions of rulership, this form of periodization is particularly inadequate for conceptualizing gender relations. A second possibility for periodization is based on the availability of different kinds of sources for reconstructing the past. This rests on the assumption that certain kinds of texts, in particular, were composed or compiled in distinct historical settings. A third and more complex attempt at periodization aims to reconstruct socioeconomic phases located implicitly or explicitly along an evolutionary axis. Clearly, the question is not simply one of chronology, but of assumptions about events or processes which are regarded as historically significant. Para. Alteker's periodization explores the second possibility. This has certain general problems, including dating texts and working out their mutual relationships. Besides, there are other difficulties which are specific to their treatment of questions of gender. Most of the texts are prescriptive, Brahminical works with an inbuilt gender bias. In other words, they represent the perspectives of high status men. As such, women have no direct voice in the composition, compilation, preservation, and transmission of such texts. In this situation, the texts need to be used for reconstructing gender relations with a certain degree of caution and with an awareness of the inherent bias. However, Alteker does not recognize these implications and uses the texts to arrive at an unproblematic literal reconstruction. Page 9. As in the case of his explanatory framework, this has a certain methodological directness which has an obvious appeal. This is evident from its adoption by other scholars, especially Sanskritists, who summarize references to women from a variety of texts, such as the Yagnavalkya Smriti, Manusmriti, etc., somewhat uncritically and mechanically. Para. In a sense, although Horner's historical agenda is more limited, she shows greater sensitivity to the complex nature of the texts she draws on. Her awareness of the variations which may have been introduced during the writing down of oral traditions and of the process of transmission through teachers and monks, with the possibility of a misogynist bias, are remarkable given that her work was first published in 1930, although these insights are not systematically developed in the way she makes use of individual texts. Para. The heirs and heiresses to Horner's legacy, if they may be so called, have opened up new areas of investigation within the framework of Buddhism. Some, such as Chakravarti, 1981, have attempted to contextualize the emergence of early Buddhism and women's place within it in terms of contemporary socioeconomic formations. Others, such as Paul, 1985, and Shaw, 1994, have focused on specific forms of Buddhism such as Mahayanism and Tantrism. In other cases, bracket opens, for example, Sponberg, Sponberg, 1992, and Richman, Richman, 1992, bracket closes, readings of Buddhist texts have been extended well beyond the somewhat literal analysis offered by Hena herself. It appears that precisely because her work is less closely structured than Alteker's, her influence has proved stimulating rather than stifling. Text continued in next file. Page 9. Introduction continued. Para. Turning to the specific question of women's agency, we find that unlike Hena, Alteker tends to view this as problematic. This is especially evident in his views on Shudra women, who are regarded as disruptive, corrupting the pure speech of Aryan women. As mentioned earlier, the former are consequently regarded as being responsible for the decline in the latter's status. These and other problems inherent in what has been characterized as the Altekerian paradigm are highlighted in Chakravarti's critic, bracket, this volume, bracket closes, stop, para. While Alteker's neat formulation can be called into question, his attempt to connect gender and Varna identities is interesting. More recently, Chakravarti, 1993, has worked out an alternative framework. As she points out, this is tentative. She situates gender relations within a context of caste and class relations and explores the extent to which the control of female sexuality is central to the creation and maintenance of caste identities in particular. Page 10. Besides, she draws attention to enforcement mechanisms including the state. This is useful in that it shifts the focus of attention from the status of women to questions of patriarchal socio-political formations. Para. Chakravarti provides a panoramic sweep from prehistoric times to early state societies. She locates prescriptive constructions of women's nature within this framework. As she observes, these are marked by an element of tension. On the one hand, we have definitions of Stri Swabhava, or women's nature, which is regarded as inherently problematic and untamable. On the other hand, we have attempts to achieve the near impossible through prescriptions of Stri Dharma, or the duty of the ideal wife who was expected to be totally devoted and subservient to her husband, bracket pativrata, bracket closes, stop. She also points out that such definitions were probably crucial for the Brahmanas on the one hand and male members of ruling clans on the other. Control over the sexuality of the wife was perhaps the most important means of maintaining masculine identities for such groups, related as these were to the transmission of material and social attributes from one generation of men to another. In this context, although caste and class identities did not coincide, they probably overlapped in many instances. Chakravarti's approach can be characterized as broadly Marxist-feminist, implying as it does that gender relations are parallel to and interact with and are in some senses constitutive of class relations. Bracket Connell, Connell, 1987, 46, bracket closes, stop. What requires further investigation is both the content and the internal articulation of specific formations as well as their contextualization and mutual relationship. Para. Although these perspectives have proved fruitful, they are by no means unproblematic. Perhaps the most serious unresolved issues stem from the use of the category of quote, woman unquote stop. Thus, we encounter essentialist, ahistorical statements about women's nature as being determined by concerns of reproduction or as being more religious than men, all of which envisage women as constituting an undifferentiated, changeless category. Para. It is obvious that we need to be sensitive to the meanings implicit in the term, quote, woman, unquote, as used by different authors in different contexts. Is the term used to refer to all those who are biologically female? Or is it explicitly or implicitly restricted to upper caste/class women of a specific region, more often than not the mid-Ganga Valley? Does it apply to women within the Brahminical framework, or, page 11, are women supportive of heterodox traditions included within it? How, if at all, is the term, quote, woman, unquote, qualified? Is the definition in terms of caste, class, or occupational groups, or in terms of location within kinship structures, or procreative or sexual status? And how important are such definitions to the arguments advanced? Are these definitions viewed as immutable, or are they regarded as constructions which are subject to change? Para. In a sense, these multiple definitions of, quote, woman, unquote, are symptomatic of the complexities of women's history. In spite of all the efforts at uniformity, the varied meanings of the term slip through. While this plurality complicates matters, it can also be viewed as a reflection of the rich potential of the field. Para. What we also need to come to terms with is the fact that there are and have been regional variations in gender relations. Some of the studies included in the present collection focus on regions, especially present-day Tamil Nadu, and in doing so provide us with a rich and varied understanding of the specificities of gender relations. However, other areas are yet to receive identical attention. These include areas where one would expect variation, such as the Northeast, for instance, which has a strong living tradition of matrilineal societies. Given that our understanding of regional histories has been sharpened in recent decades, especially for areas such as Orissa, it is to be hoped that attempts will be made to focus on gender relations within such frameworks in future. Para. As important is the fact that vast chronological expanses remain unexplored from the perspective of women's histories. For instance, the millennia assigned to prehistory and to a lesser extent proto-history, as well as the early medieval period, require investigation. In the absence of detailed studies, the possibility of attributing the origins of gender stratification to the remote past in particular remains temptingly open. This is a tendency which has been observed in other contexts. Conkey, Conkey, 1991, within brackets, comma, especially within the discipline of archaeology. The quest for origins tends to divert attention from the specific features of gender relations in different historical situations and needs to be embarked on, if at all, with caution. Para. Meanwhile, what we have, more often than not, are sweeping generalizations about the position of women in early India. While readers will inevitably find a number of such statements in the present volume, they would do well to bear in mind that these require qualification, which is best done by focusing on the page 12 perspectival, spatial, and chronological location of the sources on which the author bases himself/herself. Section 2, text continued in the next file. Page 12, introduction continued. Section 2, para. The material structure underlying gender stratification has been the focus of considerable attention for decades, if not since the last century. This, in turn, has involved attempts to identify crucial elements within such structures and to work out their gendered nature. It is in this context that one can locate the concern with the question of women's access to property. Para. In the article included in the present collection, Bhattacharya argues that the preoccupation with the nature and concerns of Stridhana, bracket literally woman's wealth, bracket closes, can be understood within the framework of colonial legal discourse. This is valuable insofar as it enables us to contextualize the contemporary interest in women's proprietary rights. While property in general was conceived of in absolute, universal terms, which was somewhat ahistorical, women's wealth or Stridhana was carefully defined in terms of movable goods such as utensils, ornaments, etc. Para. What permitted the classification of this assortment of goods under a single term seems to have been their distinctive relation to productive processes. Virtually none of these goods could have been directly used for production. In other words, any notion of economic empowerment through access to such resources was obviously limited. Besides, in economic contexts where monetization may have been weak, the possibilities of converting Stridhana into productive resources may have been limited. As such, the focus on Stridhana as women's legitimate property could also mean restricting their access to other kinds of resources. Para. Bhattacharya also draws attention to the fact that customs or norms governing inheritance are not uniform, but reveal variations over space and time. Mukund, bracket, this volume, bracket closes, points to the social nature of such variations, arguing that access to property would have varied, quote, across regions, /subregions, /castes, /classes, /families, unquote, page 123. Para. At another related and more fundamental level, definitions of property are subject to change. As Bhattacharya points out, notions of property have a history. For example, in the early Vedic context, absolute rights to land do not seem to have been important. Page 13. Thus, what constitutes property is in itself variable, as are definitions of legitimate and illegitimate uses of and access to property. In this situation, the process of codifying laws regarding property, bracket, as indeed other laws, bracket closes, can be viewed as both representative of and embedded in changing notions of property and its control. As such, they may not necessarily directly reflect the prevalent system governing relations to property. Para. Bhattacharya's and Mukund's focus on the means whereby women could legitimately acquire property is also interesting. They point out that these included gifts which were to be exchanged between kinsmen and women as opposed to resources acquired through direct participation in and control over productive processes. In other words, ideally women's wealth was generated within and restricted to certain domains. In a sense, this can be viewed as the logical corollary of the emphasis on Stridhana as women's sole legitimate property. Clearly, women were not expected to earn through labor or through participation in trade or productive processes. Para. At another level, one can compare gift exchanges which were legitimately open to women with other forms of gifts, such as dakshina or dana, which evidently constituted an important element of social, material, and ritual transactions in early India. These can be situated within broader systems of distribution. As Akker, ACKER bracket 1988:477-8 bracket closes, argues, more generally, differential access to distribution/distributive processes may in fact be as constitutive of class relations as relations of production. This can then provide us with a more nuanced understanding of the implication of the rights of women to property as recognized within prescriptive Sanskritic traditions. Para. Within this framework, Mukund draws attention to the conventional perception in Tamil Nadu that Devadasis were the only women who had proprietary rights. While we will be focusing on the courtesanal tradition subsequently, Section 3, we may note that Mukund's own investigation, as well as that of Gupta, Section 2, and Singh, Section 4, would indicate that other categories of women had access to and could dispose of property as well. Para. Mukund uses inscriptional evidence pertaining to economic transactions involving women. Apart from the evidence on women who made donations to religious institutions and implicitly controlled resources they transferred, she includes data on women buying and selling land and receiving assignments of land revenue. Besides, page 14, she attempts to categorize women through a combination of caste/class/occupational characteristics, recognizing women belonging to ruling families, those of the landed elites, and the Tevaratier, Tevaratiar, Tevaratier or temple servants, who would have included the Devadasis. The breaking down of economic transactions and of categories of women involved in them opens up possibilities for a more complex understanding of women's proprietary rights as opposed to homogenized, simplistic generalizations. This enables Mukund to substantiate her argument for variations both amongst women on the one hand and between prescriptive statements and operative transactions on the other. Para. Mukund examines the system of Mancal, Mancal, Kani, Kani, or turmeric land which evidently passed from mother to daughter on the latter's marriage. This was literally meant to provide turmeric, regarded as one of the symbols of auspiciousness in Tamil society. The size of the land could vary according to family status and the number of siblings, bracket, personal communication, comma, Kanchana Natarajan, bracket closes, stop. Mukund suggests that these land rights may be connected with the prevalent regional kinship and marital system which privileged cross-cousin marriage or marriage with the maternal uncle. This is an interesting instance of a matrilineal system of inheritance embedded in and coexisting with a predominantly patrilineal structure. It also implicitly points to the question of postmarital residence, which has been regarded as an important factor in determining the extent to which women exercise effective property rights, especially over immovable resources such as land. Para. Mukund contextualizes the data in terms of the growing importance of the temple-centered agrarian economy in early medieval Tamil Nadu. She draws attention to the relative paucity of such transactions during earlier and subsequent phases. This is an interesting connection which has been tested in other regional contexts as well. For instance, Parashar and Naik, 1986, Singh, 1990. What also requires exploration is the extent to which the transactions women were involved in converge with or diverge from those of the categories of men through whom they established their identity. This would enhance our understanding of the context within which such transactions may be located. As Whitehead, 1984:176, observes more generally, property relations are not so much about people and things as about people and people. In other words, it is the differential access which different social groups have to specific resources rather than any autonomous or intrinsic value these resources may have, page 15, which endows such relations with social meaning. Para. Another interesting point which Mukund touches on in passing is the relationship of women belonging to mercantile categories to property. She points out that while women in Chettiar families evidently controlled and managed property in the absence of male members of the household who were engaged in long-distance trade, the former had no rights to inheritance. What is implied is that issues such as inheritance/control/management are not synonymous, nor do rights in one sphere necessarily translate into another. Given that we have a variety of evidence for the existence of trading networks in early India involving long-distance voyages over land and sea, in many cases, the role of women within such activities or in terms of them can be fruitfully investigated. It is likely that this can provide a context for exploring a different intersection between gender relations and economic processes. Para. Chitralekha Gupta's essay on rural-urban dichotomy raises a number of interesting questions on the relationship between women's status and what are conventionally identified as major turning points in socio-economic history. She focuses on what is often termed the second urbanization in Indian history, that of the Ganga Valley, beginning in the mid-first millennium BC and attaining its greatest development between the 2nd century BC and 2nd century AD. Combining inscriptional evidence with textual sources, she argues that the rural-urban divide was probably not as sharp as is commonly visualized, and that there was a degree of interpenetration between the two domains. As such, certain relatively conservative values which she associates with rural society persisted even within the urban context. Para. Gupta suggests that the interaction between the rural and urban sectors and its complexities are reflected in the strategies women adopted to define their identities. Evident in votive inscriptions, many women identified themselves in terms of their place of residence. This, Gupta argues, would point to a degree of autonomy from kinship structures which may have been possible within the relatively fluid social context of urban centers. However, she points out that such trends are by no means simple or unilinear. In some urban centers, such as Mathura, women continued to identify themselves in terms of kinship categories or in terms of the occupations or professions of their husbands. The evidence for women being identified in terms of their own occupations is relatively limited. Page 16. Moreover, women do not seem to have exercised control over productive processes in either rural or urban areas. Text continued in next file. Page 16. Introduction continued. Para. For the subsequent historical phase identified with the Gupta Empire, she cautions against its acceptance as a golden age in Indian history, suggesting that this may not have marked any improvement in the situation as far as women were concerned. In fact, it is the period from which we have the first definite epigraphic reference to Sati from North India. Para. Gupta's work opens up the possibility of investigating women's relationship to the economy from a distinctive perspective. She focuses on what are conventionally recognized as phases of growing economic complexity and reinvestigates them from the perspective of women's history. What emerges is an understanding that such socioeconomic phases may have had a different meaning for men and women. Para. Implicit in some of these arguments is an understanding that the class position of women needs to be problematized rather than assumed. This is not necessarily identical with that of the men to whom we are related as daughters, wives, mothers, and sisters. This is a possibility which requires further development and investigation. Besides, class relations were not identical in urban and rural areas. As such, the analysis of each will pose specific problems and require specific methodologies. Tentatively, one can suggest that as there is ample evidence for changing / different patterns of land ownership in early India, one can explore the implications of such differences in providing the material underpinnings for varied gender relations in situations where agriculture constituted by far the most important of economic activities. Besides, as suggested earlier, one can analyze specific economic activities in terms of both relations of production and distribution in order to uncover their gendered nature more fully. Para. Vijaya Ramaswamy's article focuses squarely on the theme of women's labor. Like Gupta, she draws on both textual and inscriptional evidence. The textual material is particularly rich and has the advantage of not being prescriptive. The vast corpus of kumkum, Cankam, literature which Ramaswamy explores has been tapped by predominantly male historians for decades. They have used it to describe political, economic, or social conditions within which women generally figure in a somewhat typical ornamental capacity as objects of beauty and desire. Bracket, Hart's, H-A-R-T apostrophe S, Hart's article, section 3, is exceptional, bracket closes, stop, page 17. Ramaswamy's exploration would suggest that this conventional notion of women is inadequate. She finds evidence for women's participation in a range of activities, including those associated with agriculture, such as planting, weeding, husking, winnowing, keeping watch over the ripening grain, etc. Apart from this, women were engaged in pastoral activities, in processing milk, in weaving and especially spinning, in making pots and baskets, in extracting oil, salt and toddy. Others were engaged in a range of services, including cooking, acting as nurses and entertainers. Some served the king in various administrative and military capacities, whereas others were temple servants. Besides, we have references to serving women and slave women. Para. Ramaswamy's account indicates the varied occupational possibilities open to and exercised by women within a single region. Given that the evidence spans a long time frame, from the 1st century BC to the 13th century AD, it can be contextualized in terms of major socio-political transformations. These range from a situation of chiefdoms or early states associated with the beginning of the kumkum era to more complex regional polities such as those of the Pallavas and Cholas. It is obvious that each of these socio-political formations would have been embedded in and in turn engendered distinctive relations of production and distribution. Consequently, the value assigned to women's bracket and men's bracket closes labor in different spheres of productive activity / production may have varied. Para. Given the near invisibility of women from economic histories, there has been an understandable preoccupation with documenting women's presence in a range of activities. In a sense, this is a necessary first step. However, bracket, and this ties in with the earlier discussion on property, bracket closes, as important is the question of the control or lack of control which women exercised over their labor and its produce. In contemporary contexts, it has been demonstrated that while women's labor is tapped for agricultural and other activities within peasant households, for example, they have little or no control over the produce generated through such activities. In other words, we need to explore whether participation in productive and other activities translated into economic or social power or not. Para. The other question which requires further exploration, although Ramaswamy touches on it in some cases, is that of the sexual division of labor. Divisions of labor, sexual or otherwise, can be either pragmatic or prescriptive, or alternatively the two may be combined, page 18, or may shed into one another. Bracket. Leibowitz, Leibowitz, Leibowitz 1986:43, bracket closes, top. Pragmatic divisions often rest on the mutual convenience of participants in labor processes and are not necessarily fixed. Prescriptive divisions, on the other hand, are likely in a situation of unequal power relations where dominant social categories may impose restrictions on participation in specific activities for both men and women. Such prescriptions may be perceived as being derived from customs or tradition. While divisions of labor are nearly universal, their specific form and content are subject to historical variation in different contexts. Ramaswamy restores laboring women to a much deserved visibility. This can provide the basis for an analysis of the extent to which such labor was viewed as gendered in specific cases. This in turn may lead to a fuller understanding of the significance attached to women's labor in this context. While a number of interesting issues are raised and examined in the essays, there are certain central themes which remain relatively unexplored. These include the nature of the household, which obviously constituted an important locus, LOCUS, through which relations of property and relations of labor were structured. As such, our understanding of these questions, even in terms of specific areas, remains somewhat limited. Para. Focusing on the household would require us to recognize its variability as well as its internal dynamics, to explore relations of production, consumption, and distribution of resources within the domestic sphere, instead of treating it as a residual and somewhat homogeneous category. Given that in pre-industrial societies, the household constituted one of the most important loci of production, and given that its members would have had gendered identities, intra-household relations require investigation. Para. We also need to recognize that intra-household relations are not necessarily altruistic. Bracket Agarwal 1994 53 to 60 bracket closes, but may in fact be structured along hierarchies of age and sex and in terms of positions within the kinship structure. Besides, it has been suggested that households need to be understood in terms of an ongoing relationship of bargaining amongst members who stand to benefit if they cooperate, but not in identical ways. Hence, there is always the possibility of conflict. These conflicts, moreover, may vary. Certain issues may be regarded as beyond dispute in a given historical context, whereas others may be open to negotiation. Some possibilities may be accorded greater legitimacy than others. Some members, page 19, may have greater bargaining power than others, possibly derived from extraneous sources of support. Relations within the household, then, would be shaped through a complex process involving material and ideological resources and, of course, people. Para. Another area which requires investigation is the extent to which access to productive and other technologies in agriculture, craft production, food processing, etc., may have been gendered. The fact that food processing has a history and a context has been rendered invisible owing to our preoccupation with accepted definitions of major historical themes. Impressionistically, there is evidence to suggest that in many societies, productive equipment such as plows or looms are regarded as being out of bounds for women. We need to explore the circumstances within which such prohibitions are located, variations, if any, the extent to which they are implemented or contested, and the implications of such prohibitions. At another level, we need to be prepared to question the assumption that technological innovation is almost by nature a male enterprise. This has been attempted by feminist archaeologists such as Gero, Gero, and Conkey, Conkey, 1990, while analyzing technologies for making stone tools, which constitute an important element of archaeological assemblages for prehistoric periods. Bracket and even subsequently bracket closes stop. They point out that there is little archaeological evidence to suggest that tool making was a masculine activity. However, the tendency of predominantly male archaeologists to project 19th and 20th century gender role stereotypes into the past made them regard all tools as representations of masculine innovation. Para. This also brings into focus the extent and forms in which economic processes, including production and distribution, are ascribed gender meanings. Bracket Acker, Acker, 1988:478, bracket closes, stop. Such a perspective can enable us to move beyond a definition of the economy as determining gender relations to a more complex relational definition of economic processes as being gendered. Para. Perhaps one of the most serious lacunae in our focus on women in relation to material conditions has been in our inability to come to terms with reproduction as a historical process. Reproduction itself has been defined in a variety of ways, ranging from a broad maximalist definition in terms of social reproduction, which includes biological procreation, the reproduction of daily life through activities such as housework, and the reproduction through socialization into distinct and multiple roles and relations. More minimalist definitions, page 20, focus on biological reproduction, which in itself is a complex process involving physiological changes which are socialized in a variety of ways. Para. As O'Brien points out, 1981:47, the physiological process can be split up into a number of moments. These include menstruation, ovulation, copulation, alienation, bracket of the male seed / sperm, bracket closes, comma, conception, gestation, labor, birth, the appropriation of the child, and nurturing it. Some of these are visible, whereas others are not. Some are involuntary, whereas others are not. As such, each of these moments can be and has been invested with a range of meanings. For example, legitimate procreation is encapsulated within a complex context, including the age of marriage, its duration, the control or regulation of pregnancies and childbirth. While we may not have quantitative data on these questions, even tracing out attitudes towards them may be illuminating. Para. It has been argued that part of the reluctance of feminist scholars, bracket including historians, bracket closes, to engage with the issue of reproduction stems from fears of being caught up in naturalist categories of analysis. After all, procreation is commonly understood as women's natural, if not only role, and as such, drawing attention to it might reinforce stereotypes about women and gender relations. What is often lost sight of is that historicizing the issue may reveal immense variations in practices surrounding menstruation, copulation, childbirth, etc., and may in fact provide the basis for a more complex understanding of reproduction. Para. In the context of the early historical situation in the mid-Ganga Valley, I have argued, bracket Roy, 1994a, bracket closes, on the basis of Brahmanical literature that attempts were made to structure biological reproduction and locate it within a specific social context. On the one hand, legitimate reproduction was linked to marriage. What is more, the wife was constructed as an instrument of procreation with her procreative powers being appropriated through a variety of rituals. As such, she was expected to participate in procreation, but her claims to the offspring produced were subordinated to those of her husband. As an extension of this, children, especially sons, were ritually connected with their fathers to ensure that sons belonged to fathers and vice versa. Besides rituals, mantras and learning were often depicted as being superior means of producing offspring as opposed to the physical process of copulation. This was reinforced by portraying related processes such as menstruation and childbirth as polluting. Page 21. In a sense, this culminated in the privileging of the Upanayana or initiation, which was regarded as a second spiritual birth. This was viewed as better than the first physical birth. At the same time, there are indications that this ritual construction of procreation was by no means uncontested. We have references, bracket, although derogatory, bracket closes, to varieties of less legitimate offspring and to men who did not get the Upanayana performed, even though they were eligible for it. Para. Even a cursory glance at later prescriptive Sanskrit literature would indicate the rich potential of the field, bracket, if that is indeed the right metaphor, bracket closes. Amongst the numerous themes on which the text's focus is that of defining procreation as involving the woman who is construed as a field, both symbolic of the fertile earth and a possession, and the male who is envisaged as the possessor of seed. This is then extended to argue that the seed determines the nature of the offspring. As such, the analogy is accorded justificatory value and becomes a mechanism for appropriating the offspring by or for the father and his lineage. While this is a fairly neat theorization, it seems to have been complicated by the fact that biological and social fatherhood did not necessarily coincide. This was resolved by according priority to the latter. What is evident nonetheless is a certain tension involved in incorporating children, bracket, especially sons, bracket closes, within the lineage. It would be fruitful to explore whether this has resonances in other kinds of sources, as well as the extent to which this construction was accepted or contested. Para. It would also be useful to explore the ways in which child rearing is treated. As will be obvious, we should not expect a monolithic system. The principles and practice of child rearing would have varied across space and time, and also in terms of social categories. The extent to which child rearing was viewed as a gendered activity, its contents and especially the gendering of children through the process need to be opened up to investigation. Asking such questions would help us to focus on the broader definition of social reproduction mentioned earlier more meaningfully. This in turn would permit us to reflect on the connection between changes in relations of production and in reproductive relations. There has been a tendency to argue that the former has a certain determinative status. Within this framework, there has been a focus on prescriptive texts which incorporate women within definitions of property. For example, Sharma, 1983, top. This status as object would have, page 22, certainly been a reality for many women, including slave women. However, one can envisage the relationship in more complex terms which can provide us with a richer understanding of economic processes. Focusing on reproduction, moreover, may provide us with a better understanding of women's relations to other resources of production. Most women and men may not have had direct access to and control over such resources in most known historical situations and would have participated in production primarily, if not solely, as laborers. As such, the weight of reproductive responsibilities and the attempts to appropriate the produce of reproductive labor, for example, children, may provide us with a better understanding of the gendered nature of specific productive processes. In other words, focusing on reproductive relations may transform our understanding not only of the relationship of women to the economy, but of the economy itself. Section 3 continued in next file.